The Dark Cosmos presents. We were on a mission to explore black holes, but found something unspeakable. Written by Tiana Petkovska. Hey Creepypasta fans, it's Teresa, and I'll be your narrator for tonight. Enjoy tonight's sci-fi horror story. Also, if you want to connect and support us, make sure to check out our Discord and Patreon links in the description. And remember, stay cosmic. The few months spent in the vicinity of Sagittarius A star, the supermassive black hole in the center of the Milky Way, had been taxing for the crew of the USS Dreadnought. To say the least. The intergalactic explorer vessel was designed to withstand the harsh conditions just outside of the region affected intensely by black holes, while an explorer class intended to roam the galaxy forever in research and investigation. Its main purpose was always reaching Sagittarius A. The USS Dreadnought was still a few thousand light-years away from the event horizon of the black hole, incapable of venturing any further, but close enough to perform their intended measurements and experiments. With a capable captain as their lead, genetically engineered to endure the effects of long bouts of space travel, and a singular purpose on their minds, the crew was, by all means, the perfect crew. Upon arrival at their orbiting location, the vast crew of the USS Dreadnought was teeming with excitement over the next year they would spend researching the supermassive black hole and the potential discoveries they would make. All of the departments were ready for the upcoming test of endurance, both physically and psychologically. Nonetheless, even the perfect calculations cannot be ready for that, which couldn't be factored into all of their preparations. It happened just around the end of the second month. Something had shifted on the ship, and everyone could feel the tension rising. There was an inescapable sense of doom and desolation that had taken over every inch of the USS Dreadnought. Olga Ivanovska, one of the junior engineers on board, was part of the small group of people that had not yet felt the full effects of the change, and remained for a little longer, unperturbed by what was happening right in front of her nose. Her superior, Chief Ilieski, held up good as well, but he had begun to suspect that something was afoot, and he didn't like the fact that he had trouble figuring out what that was exactly. The two of them would talk endlessly on the matter during their shared shifts in engineering, correcting the course of the massive vessel for the changing conditions of their exterior environment. They, much rather he, felt helpless about changing whatever it was that was affecting the crew and the conditions of their interior environment. At first, Ilieski would notice small things among his subordinates. Then, certain strange behaviors would creep up among the higher-level personnel, until it seemed that only he and Ivanovska were the only sane left on the entire USS Dreadnought. If I didn't know any better, I would say that we have been infiltrated by some kind of mind-altering alien parasite, he would often tell Ivanovska in jest. And I'm not sure if me thinking that is me or the thing. As time went on, Ivanovska started agreeing with her superior. Everything he had logged about the behavior of the crew Ilieski gave over to her, for if he too fell victim to whatever was influencing the USS Dreadnought, she would be able to take over from where he left off. Of course, it didn't occur to him that she as well could succumb to it. Then one day, after tiresome months spent problem-solving and troubleshooting together in engineering, Ilieski simply didn't show up for his shift. Ivanovska tried him on the comms, but there was no answer. And after he didn't show up for the entire shift, she went looking for him in his quarters. When she got there, Ivanovska found the quarters completely vacant, stripped out of everything that belonged to Ilyeski. All of his possessions, mementos, and even his name on the hatch had been removed. Shaken by what she had witnessed, Ivanovska went straight to the top and tried to establish a comm channel with the captain of the USS Dreadmont. It took a few tries to cut through the busy schedule of the captain, but eventually she managed to get her on comms and explain the whole ordeal to her. The way that Ivanovska explained it made the case of a missing engineer sound like an abduction. However, the matter was much worse than she had originally anticipated. The captain, after listening to her rant for about half an hour, told her that her second-in-command had been busy looking for this Ilyeski on the ship's manifest, but no such name could be found on the list. Worried about the young engineer, the captain ordered Ivanovska to report to the infirmary and see if she is suffering from exhaustion. Since Ivanovska wasn't able to convince the captain otherwise, she caved and went to see one of the ship's doctors. "There's nothing wrong with you, kid," he said. "I've noticed it happening as well." Apparently, not only had the doctor lost 2 of his attendants mysteriously, but he'd been getting personnel from all over the ship sharing the same story as Ivanovska. They were all sent there by either the captain or their superiors. To make the mystery even deeper, only some of the crew members were able to even remember the missing people, while the rest were completely impervious to their existence in the first place. The doctor had told her that he noticed himself forgetting things about his attendants, as if the process of their deletion from his mind was slower than with the rest. Although he was a very curious and quick-witted man, he had no theories as to why and how such a thing would happen. If he wasn't so convinced that there were 2 attendants in his employ on the USS Dreadmont, he would have thought it was some kind of mass delusion. Without a satisfying end to their conversation, the doctor prescribed Ivanovska with some nootropics to boost her memory retention and told her to go back to work acting as if nothing had happened, just to be safe. That night, she went back to her quarters and opened the crew logs that Ilyeski had been documenting before his disappearance. They were all empty. Not a single word had remained in them. The logs had disappeared just as suddenly as the man that recorded them. Precisely 1 month later, and several more engineers gone missing, Ivanovska walked onto the engineering deck for her shift, only to find them all back at their posts. Even Ilyeski had returned. Naturally, Ivanovska rushed to him, happy to see him back and well. However, what she found tinkering with the controls on his post was not the engineer she remembered. In fact, the expression on his face and the shallow look in his eyes had revealed a much different figure from the man she used to know. It was as if his body was returned to the USS Dreadmont without any soul left in it, without any human mind and human sentience remaining to govern it properly. After all that had happened, Ivanovska didn't have it in her to begin questioning him about where he was and if something was done to him. But she didn't shrug it off either. She carefully watched him work during their shift, and the minute that it was over, she ran to the doctor to explain what had happened. It had been a month since she saw him last. She couldn't have guessed that the same would happen to the doctor as well. He was a shell of a man. Words came out of him, but they were as vacant as his long stare. Another month had passed in which Ivanovska had nothing to do but watch how most of the crew of the USS Dreadmont would disappear, then reappear just as suddenly and inexplicably as previously. A few nervous breakdowns later, and many antipsychotics combined with nootropics, she came to realize that the change had happened much earlier than she or Ilieski had noticed. It had been the reason why the atmosphere on the ship had changed so radically when eventually they did notice. One by one, deck by deck, department by department, the crew of the USS Dreadmont had been swapped with things that looked like people and started off from Earth, but were no more them. As I am you or you are me. They spoke like humans and behaved somewhat like humans, but Ivanovska believed at that point that they were no such thing. Not anymore, at least. And some of them, not for a long time. A few more months later, just as the mission was coming close to its end, and the USS Dreadmont was about to disembark from its orbit, the ship was not the same one that left our helisphere and embarked on the journey to the center of the galaxy. Ivanovska wasn't sure if she was the same person either. She had barely spoken to anyone since Ilieski had returned a changed man. She had isolated herself, as if protecting her body from a virus or a parasite that could be easily transmitted from person to person. However, the thing that was changing the ship and the crew couldn't affect her in any way known to her, or in any way she could stop it if it had begun. There were a few people on the ship that she recognized as still human, but they were battling the situation in their own ways. That didn't seem effective to Ivanovska either. Those ways weren't very civil or very becoming of members of the perfect crew of the USS Dreadmont. Them she avoided even more than the rest. When it came down to it, Ivanovska shouldn't have troubled over what was happening inside of the intergalactic explorer, but rather over that which was looming outside. The fear that the mission to the galactic center was ending, and that soon the USS Dreadmont would come in contact with other human vessels roaming the galaxy, drove her to finally come out of hiding and figure out what was really happening. The clock was ticking, and she was afraid of letting loose whatever had taken over the USS Dreadmont among the rest of humanity. Ivanovska's only course of action was to finally confront Ilieski and see if he would even grasp the information she would demand from him. Should she not manage to get answers and devise a solution to the problem of the vessel, Ivanovska made up her mind to drive the USS Dreadmont just past the threshold of safety and ever closer to the gravitational pull of the supermassive black hole, to be crushed in the dense material that surrounded it, even before reaching the event horizon. Sitting on his bed in his quarters, Ivanovska found Ilieski staring at the blank walls, looking almost as if he was waiting for her to come. This was, of course, her own interpretation of the situation, and not reflective of the reality she couldn't understand. She asked him a few small things of a personal nature, which he shrugged off like he had no idea what she was talking about. However, when she began speaking about the USS Dreadmont and its crew, it looked like a light was switched on in his mind, and his attitude changed almost completely. He was ready to finally talk, and the things he had to say were nothing that Ivanovska could have expected, or frankly, even imagined. "I am not who you think I am," was the first thing he uttered once the light was switched. That much she already knew. The thing that looked and sounded like Ilieski was not even remotely human. and not even remotely like any living organism she had ever seen or heard about. While it maintained an organic form and build, since it possessed all the materials needed to make such a thing, it had never operated a body of that sort ever before. The months in which the crew was missing were time the thing had spent learning and harvesting the control of humanoid bipedal organic structures. To Ivanovska's question about what it was, the thing that took Ilieski's form simply answered, "I am forever, and I am alone." The sentience that now took a human face was sitting heavily on the bed in one of the quarters of the USS Dreadnought. Was exactly what Ivanovska and her crew were there to investigate and research. In all the wildest fringe theories from the history of science about what black holes were, no one had ever presumed that what lay in the super-dense core of a collapsed star could be a sentient thing. And the Ilieski that sat across from Ivanovska, the changed crew that walked the halls of the USS Dreadnought, were just manifestations it had created to finally be able to communicate with the rest of the universe without sucking the life right out of it. What Ilieski had told Ivanovska didn't sway her decision about destroying the ship, but reinforced it even more. In fact, the moment she realized that she was dealing with an alien thing so different than anything she had ever thought of, she ran out of the quarters and directly toward engineering. There wasn't anything good that could possibly come out of letting cosmic beings bearing the mind of a black hole roam the galaxy where other organics lived. She was approaching her own personal event horizon, since there was nothing that she could do and no way to save herself or the remaining crew. Escape pods wouldn't work in this situation, and the USS Dreadnought had no alternative ways of protecting surviving crew should there be a catastrophe on board, much less a protocol for the scenario that the vessel was in at the moment. A few of the rest that had remained human joined her in engineering to help her lock in the procedure for driving the ship into the dense cloud Sagittarius A. They had regained back an inkling of their sanity after being confronted with the dire situation on board, and had decided that Ivanovska was right. She was lucky that none of them have made an alternative decision and fought her for control of the USS Dreadnought, wanting to remain among the living no matter the cost. In the final moments before the last set of protocols were put in to get the USS Dreadnought into gear, Ilieski entered engineering. He didn't have to announce himself for Ivanovska to see him approaching. Strangely, he nor anyone else from the changed crew was fighting to stop her either. They had no feeling of self-preservation, since they would only be returning to their source. However, Sagittarius A star had one last thing to say while it still had lips and another being to speak to. Ilieski came close to Ivanovska and leaned in, whispering in her ear, as soon as she heard the words it had to tell. She began crying and pressed the final command on the console in front of her, sending the last surviving crew members of the USS Dreadnought into oblivion, and the rest back into the warm embrace of utter and inescapable darkness. What Sagittarius A star said to Ivanovska remained solely hers.